Well, welcome to another episode of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast. I'm your host, Robert Baldwin. Today we have a returning guest, my friend Jerry Grover. He appeared previously over a year ago on episode 12 on the solar eclipse and Christ's birth and 2 days of brightness and signs. I'll link to that in the show notes. Jerry, thanks again for agreeing to come on a second time to this podcast.
Yeah, it's great.
For those who may have missed the first episode, do you want to give like a brief overview of yourself, like your education and your research interests and so forth?
Yeah, I'm college educated, basically an undergraduate in geological engineering. Went to grad school in mechanical engineering, but shifted to civil engineering. And so professionally, I'm a licensed professional geologist, also a licensed professional structural engineer. And I've also worked as a translator for the past 3 years, just freelance family business. My research interests mostly, or at least Book of Mormon wise, is kind of, specialized in things that are a little more scientific, and then linguistic is kind of research I do, and then also I do support some research that's independent along those lines, meaning people that don't really have access to like college, university. They have a good project that kind of falls in that classification. And I do other, done a few papers. I have academic website access to where I've kind of dealt with just little small issues like the Book of Mormon stuff. What does great cities contemplate? There's a paper on that basically saying it's not population units of distance. Small kind of eclectic little things aren't really like full article grade, but are kind of useful. They're doing research.
Okay, well, that's your background. So you actually have 2 presentations, one on the gold plates and one answering some issues about Book of Mormon chronology today. So what I'll do is I'll go into the background and I'll let you take as long as you want on these particular topics.
Okay. Okay. Robert asked me today he basically raised an issue of at least a new book that's out by an individual raising some issues about plates, golden plates. They're not really specifically new arguments. Again, it's critical of Joseph Smith's story. So I prepared a little presentation kind of dealing with the actual metallurgy of the plates and what the thickness of them are. And then, because that's kind of the assertion, again, kind of the similar that basically they're too heavy. And also one issue that's raised, it wasn't addressed in my book, is that if indeed it's Tabaga, that Tabaga, the corrosion, buried Tabaga corrodes, and so that doesn't match the description. So that's kind of the gist of the presentation, and I'll just go through it. And if anybody or Robert would like to ask questions, that'd be fine too, interrupting. But I did write a book, Ziff, Magic Goggles, and Golden Plates, where most of this is coming from. It's available on my website, and Robert will give you that to you later. But so it was written back in 2015, so it's some years ago. As again, I said, I wrote a professionally edited book on Ziff and metallurgical plates back in 2015. And by the way, when I'm going to show a screen, it doesn't mean I'm going to read everything on there. I just have it up there for people that maybe want to go back and look at the information. I try to make my PowerPoints informative, not just some pictures and things. People just points of discussion, but also that if you're interested in getting into the details, it's available. So again, these assertions were made by this individual. Basically, the plates would have been too heavy to carry if they consist of Tabaga. And also, if in order to basically be resistant from corrosion, the gold alloy has to have over 50% gold. And then the second is there would not have been sufficient space on the plates for the Book of and I indicate, of course, typical, the book does not cite any of my material in any way or any other people that are contrary to their view. So I understand the individual's got a PhD, has been a professor, so I think he should be aware of kind of the obligation, academic publication, to actually entertain or at least address contrary points of view. Failed to do that. So anyway, so that's kind of the background based on the discussion. So we'll go on to note that also this individual, I don't think he had any experience with metallurgy. It's also important to point out that none of the people that dealt with the plates at the time were metallurgists or haven't seemed to have much knowledge of metallurgy. So when there's statements made by them, we kind of have to take them in the context of they're just doing a general description. It's not some technical description of the plates. So the color of the plates, there's a variety of people that mentioned it or secondhand mentioning of it. They didn't see the plates, but they heard about it. Generally speaking, it's, they talked about them being golden. There's, one report of pure gold, but for the most part, kind of the consistent ones who actually saw the plates. I mean, Joseph Smith Jr. said the appearance of gold, others called them golden. So we're not looking at, I think they recognize at least that they weren't necessarily just a pure gold. Then there are some descriptions of the color and types of engravings. There were engravings on both sides of the plates, appeared to be ancient. They were clearly engraved, cut into the plates. And then it's also mentioned that the engravings themselves were filled with black cement or some black heart stain. Orson Pratt said, I guess as recounted to him, that that would make the letters more legible, easier to read. So you have black with a gold black background, which I say that's not the case, but I don't think that's the reason why they were filled with black cement initially. Really, there was only very few that, William Smith indicated a mixture of gold and copper. So how he would know that was copper, obviously, at least somebody may have seen something greenish. Josiah Stoll said he saw a corner of the plates had a greenish cast to them. So there may have been a little bit of copper, what you call degradation. The thickness and configuration of the plates, again, these are just general descriptions: thickness of tin, plates of tin, thick as parchments, thick as a pane of glass. But one of the parameters, one of the descriptions actually lends itself to some scientific evaluation. That is, they seem to be pliable like thick paper and rustle with a metallic sound. When you went through them with your thumb. And I think Catherine Smith, I didn't include it here, so they tinkled or something. So there's actually, that's a parameter maybe that I thought I could look at when I was actually doing this research. Plates were fastened together with 3 D-shaped rings. That seems to be pretty consistent. Then a portion of the plates were somehow bound together, meaning the sealed portion is what people basically refer to it as. It was described as kind of solid as a piece of wood, solder. There's some descriptions like solder. So we do have to take that in, because I'm going to do a calculation basically using I'm going to back calculate alloy mix is one thing I wanted to do. So I have to kind of take into consideration what additional metal there may have been, like the D rings. One thing I didn't really take into account was there's also Fayette Lapham described in his report that Joseph Smith Sr. said there was the interpreters were in a little lid compartment on top. I didn't really consider that because there was really no way I didn't know lifting them, whether the interpreters were in there or not, or how thick that was. I just kind of ignored it, but that is something that could change the results. Weigh the plates, 40 to 60 pounds, about 60 pounds. So that's kind of the range that we're looking at. Again, I'm going to use the parameters and dimensions to, the kind of the point of the study was, number one, see if I could figure out the thickness of the plates, and then also look at, because then I could say, okay, if you have a thickness, then the next thing you have to look at is the void space between the plates. And so I actually have some measurements taken from ancient works. These are mostly South American plates, because that's kind of the theory, is it's an alloy of at least copper and gold, probably gold, silver, and copper as a base metal. And we'll talk about Tabaga and how it's made. But, so the premise is I'm kind of take these parameters that we know or have been, documented and work backwards through the calculation to see if I can arrive at those kinds of basically alloy mix and number of plates. The dimensions of the plates, there is some variation here, 8 by 7, 7 by 6. I just used Joseph Smith Jr.'s 6 inches wide by 8 inches long. Again, there's going to be some range of uncertainty in my calculations because of the weight, and the dimension isn't, has some variability potentially. One thing that's important to talk about, because we're talking about corrosion as well, is basically the preservation of the plates. Oliver Cowdery gave a pretty good description. Joseph Smith also gave one talking about there was cross-section stones on the bottom of the box. But what's pretty clear is that whoever designed this box, assuming it's Moroni, did know something about long-term preservation of metals buried. Because the box is basically sealed with cement. It has stones on the side. Cement tends to be permeable to water, and understanding that water in contact with the soil is the primary pathways of corrosion in metal. So this box was actually designed so that wouldn't happen. So you have stones that are used, which probably the ones that use probably are impermeable to water. There's 3 little pillars that come up from the bottom, and the plates set on top of those. So he's actually minimizing any contact with anything other than 3 little points of pillars to hold the plates up. And so they're basically not contacting anything on any side other than the very bottom points. The actual top, the capstone, was larger than the box, so it would precipitation. It would shed water to the side, and it wouldn't go into the box. So it was actually, preventing any precipitation getting inside the box from the top. I suspect it probably was maybe sealed on the top 2 against the capstone, but we don't know that because it got pried off. The other thing is the placement on the hill. It wasn't on the crown of the hill, where you might, over time, you get erosion exposing, the box. It was to the side, still on top. And especially in that geologic environment, it's a drumlin, which basically is made up of glacial till, tends to be fairly permeable to water, so the water doesn't perch as the precipitation goes into the ground. So you wouldn't have water built up on the top of the hill. It would seem to move through it. So it would not be a place where you would get impounded water against the box. So it's actually seems to be, wasn't just haphazard. It was actually designed in such a way as to preserve metal objects. As I mentioned, one of the principal causes of corrosion is water in contact with the soils. Kind of just discussed this, why the box was designed and positioned to avoid those 2 things. The other thing is, wanted to kind of look at is do we know what metals were used to make the plates. And the original text is helpful in the sense that there was a discussion of them after they landed, they went through the wilderness and they encountered, as this verse says, we did find a manner of ore, both of gold and silver and copper. There is in the LDS version, there's a chapter break there, and then it continues with the next verse. In the original text, the 1830 edition, there isn't. And so it just segues right in, and it came to pass that the Lord commanded me, therefore I did make plates of ore. So it seems pretty clear from the text he's telling us that probably it was gold, silver, and copper was the alloy mix. The plates that Nephi made, again, we aren't told very much about plates that Mormon and then Moroni made a few, but presumably it was similar. Moroni, as I mentioned at the bottom, refers to ore. He was lacking ore. So physical attributes, basically, you have old world techniques that Nephi would have known. Then you've got to look at new world techniques. So there's kind of two elements that have to be looked at in terms of the underlying technology of the manufacture of the plates. So, as was mentioned, the plate surface was golden, whitish yellow. There's no discussion of any tarnish, really. A little bit of like maybe green cast on the corner of the plates, which may have just been the portion of the sealed portion, so it may not have been the plates themselves. One thing is that the geological environment which gold is deposited in, typically silver is also deposited there as well, meaning you don't typically find just pure gold, 100% pure gold if you're looking at a native source. It usually does include some silver, from 5 to 30, 40% silver. So they didn't really have the ability to separate the gold from the silver through any smelting process. Time Lehi left, that was developed later. So we can assume that there may have been some silver in the plate manufacturing. That's only important because then the question is, okay, if that's the case, they couldn't have just like coated it with gold or something. If it had silver in it, you would have black. It would still blacken to some extent, probably on the surface, some surface. Although, as mentioned, if you get above 50% gold in your alloy, your corrosion is not that great, but you still would have expected some. So somehow we have to arrive at the point where we have a pure gold surface or relatively pure surface technology. And there was really only one technology known in the old world how to do that. It's called depletion gilding. And it's a process to actually take your base alloy and create this gold surface. Engravings were also described, as we mentioned, filled with black cement. And so there's two possibilities to explain that. Number one, the material is a corrosion byproduct, meaning the engravings themselves got corroded, which is what you might expect with this depletion gilding. The base metal, I mean, depletion gilding, you have a base metal which would consist of your gold, copper, and silver alloy, and then you use this process to actually get gold on the surface. So if you're engraving through that gold surface, unless you try to depletion gild the engraving itself, which would be difficult, you would probably destroy the engraving because you have to heat it and burnish it. Essentially, you have to do something. The engravings themselves might be exposed with the base metal of copper or silver, so you might have corrosion. The second is there was something placed in the engravings, which that's what it seems to sound because they talk about it cement or stain. So it's not being described as a corrosion. byproduct. So something was purposely placed or created there as a way to protect the underlying basement. This kind of is just kind of the chemistry of gold, why it's resistant. You know, you can oxidize gold, but not in natural environments. You have to have a totally different pH, which doesn't occur in nature. So that's why gold doesn't oxidize in natural environments. And I'm not going to go through all the chemistry details here. I did look and say, okay, if you're looking at a corrosion byproduct, which ones would generate a black color? So I was kind of thorough, saying, okay, look at these, and which also may be what ended up being in the engravings, but purposely created to put there as some sort of a black material. So I kind of narrowed down which ones probably chemicals might actually be ones that make up the black engravings. But it does look like, as I mentioned, there was really no blistering or anything else described, because if you had those engraving exposed and were being corroded, you would expect that underneath the gold you would have some corrosion, that type of thing. So it does look like there was placed a patina, the cement itself or the material that's being generated is there purposely, and makes sense, as they recognize that those could be subject to corrosion. The manufacturers also engraved the plates, so they did create a method to protect the engravings from corrosion. That's kind of what we discuss here. Is they call it there's a technique called patination, the patina, which is a way of creating an oxidized form of the metal, in a sense, to protect the underlying metal. Oxidized meaning, because once it's oxidized, once you oxidize the metal, that's what corrosion is. It's an oxidation, just like rust. Iron, for example, you get water, it turns red because the iron is going to FeO or Fe2O3. It's taking on oxygen and then it corrodes. That's really the corrosion process. So the patina itself is basically, you have something that's already oxidized, a metal that's already oxidized, so it's not going to be subject to further corrosion because it's already been oxidized. That would serve as a protective surface. Patination was known in the Old World. Also, part of my research project was to look at the patination in the New World, and it was a known technique. Now this is what was done here. This is not my research. This was just done by somebody else, and he wasn't, could care less about Book of Mormon or plates or anything, but he actually did some experimentation with this depletion gilding, which basically is method of what was done is you would take the alloy, create or place an acid on the surface, and then heat it, and also burnish it, meaning rub it very hard in a series, doing it a series of times, depending on the quality of the surface that you wanted. And it would oxidize off the copper and the silver, and then they would, by burnishing, by rubbing it, by heating it, they'd remove those oxidized chemicals. And so you would end up with a layer of gold on the surface. So you'd still have the underlying gold, silver, copper alloy, but on the surface, you would have this kind of pure gold. What he did is he scratched it, just did different things on the surface, and then heated it different temperatures, and in fact was able, you can see kind of the second one from the left on the top, basically created where the scratches were full of a copper oxide black that kind of served as a patina. So that, what I propose is kind of that technique there, looks to be similar to what you would see on the plates, that kind of metal surface with black. The scratches would be the engravings. These various depletion gilding techniques were used anciently in the New World. So this is where you hear the term Tabaga. And some of them had lower, there were different ranges of gold content. This is just an example of one that had, at least had some black coloration on it. I'm not saying it was the exact same technique, but I kind of pointing out that gold surface with a black on is not known. What would be done would be BC. It was talked about that there was some solder as the sealed portion. I kind of, again, we don't know exactly. There were kind of various kind of vague descriptions of it. But anyways, solder was known. Soldering techniques were known in the New World. So if that's the case, if there was some sort of soldering used to seal the plates, some people show it as a band or, but the point is though, is if they, that it would make sense if they did that, but again, they would need to solder and actually done depletion gilding on the material as well to protect it from corrosion. So if there was this material used, which they could have used the same alloy, use kind of the soldering technique. It either had to be pure gold, which they probably didn't have, or been able to, they had to depletion gild this material as well. So now I'm getting to, okay, I kind of know the technique. Basically, we're looking at depletion gilding. So now I'm going to concentrate. So I kind of, and basically I'll assume in the depletion gilding that they probably did at least 10 microns. That's a good quality Tabaga, where you get 10 microns thick of gold on the surface. So knowing that, I kind of know how to, you know, what thickness is gold on covering the surface of everything. But then I need to know how many, you know, what is the surface area, right? So you have to determine the thickness of the plates and the separation. So as discussed before, the metallic rustling, common tin, and parchment. Well, yes, and Catherine Smith said they rippled through her fingers and heard a tinkle of a sound. So she actually gives similar kind of a secondary witness to Emma, talking about they could kind of rustle through them and they made a I did look at common tin. Again, this is not a, they didn't, nobody had a micrometer reading them, but you can get N as thin as 0.001667 10 of the time. So, and then variable parchments were also. So again, I looked at that parameter and said, okay, you can get some ranges there, but let's go to the more scientific one, and that is to try to recreate what thicknesses of the alloy mixes could generate this rustling, be able to thumb through kind of like parchment. So in order to test the parameter, first I just said, okay, let's use just soft annealed copper, which, you know, is very soft. Could easily be engraved, but, and the plates were probably tempered and would have been stiffer, knowing ancient metalworking. But I did do the soft copper. I did get a rustling, but in the thinner. But the problem was, is it was pretty well apparent that the soft copper would bend at the slightest bump, meaning the edges would bend. I mean, you could actually engrave both sides of the soft copper down to 0.005 inches without, you know, because it was engraved on both sides, so you can't have it pushing through to the other side. You can actually, and I did use kind of, again, I'm not a engraver, but I did just kind of use a bone tool, kind of what you may have expected that they primitively used to engrave. And then at least that I kind of got a range saying, okay, I know it's not this. I need to look at tempered copper, because that's what ancient metal work. but it was just an easy kind of test case to get a range. So I was actually, I didn't want to order like 100 different specially made copper plates if I could kind of get a range from the soft copper, which is you can just find out hardware store to give you, something kind of a range in which to shoot for my next level of testing. So then I was to look at the temper copper. I did look at and trying to recreate what the plates would have been. I did look at the hardness of that has been documented of ancient metal work, and tried to get there's kind of a modulus of elasticity, which is used to describe the stiffness, and then there's also hardness. There's different ways of measuring hardness of metals, but I used the range of both of those would have been expected. So the hardness, basically with ancient metalwork, was 100 to 120 HV, which is a Vickers scale, different scales, which obviously is viewers here. And then you have 9 karat gold, which is a percent. 24 carats a full percent. So there's 100%. And then it talks about, and then I kind of looked at what that could be annealed to. So I got a pretty good range for the hardness. And again, I assumed that it was probably cold work or worked hardened. Doesn't mean it's cold, but it means it's lower temperature working of the melting gold, which is not really indicated in the Book of Mormon, to be honest. Because they actually use the term ore, and the plates, like the jaredite plates, were ore, the plates of ore, plates of gold. They use it interchangeably, so I think you're not looking at a smelting process of taking some complex ore and extracting metal. The elasticity, I couldn't really find any data on the ancient work, but it doesn't. I became less concerned about that parameter just because the elasticity doesn't change that much based on the working. So I figured whatever I ordered or could get, I didn't need to establish that as a parameter, because that basically, if I ordered one with a certain modulus of elasticity, it wasn't going to reach. So then I began testing each of these different sheets of copper. As I mentioned, the soft copper I did from 0.004 to 0.10. Again, once you get too much above that, you don't get the flipping effect. And then I basically used 0.04, 0.005, 6, 7, 8. And again, the maximum thickness where you could get the rustling is 0.01. So I did get that effect in all of those ranges below 0.01, but remembering that once you get too thin, you'll start pushing through. So I kind of arrived at probably the plate thickness was 0.007, maybe up to 0.01, but 0.01 got a little harder to do the rustling, flipping through. So that's kind of the range. So then I created, because I didn't use gold silver alloy, obviously, for the test, because gold is quite expensive. So it's like, I'm not going to order all these plates. So I arrived at one that a thickness that seemed to match the parameters in the copper, and then I had the gold silver alloy made with this percentage, 45% copper, 17% silver. Wasn't saying that was the, I had determined the alloy mix exactly, but because I couldn't do that until I knew, got the thickness of plates and surface area. So I assumed that, and it actually did generate, it actually was similar to the copper. So in terms of the rustling, we're flipping through. And so I didn't use a standard formula of 9 karat gold. I created one. I had a goldsmith create one at 85% copper, 12% gold, 3% silver, which ended up being kind of close to where we ended up anyway. So that was kind of fortunate, I guess, but I kind of guessed. Again, that one, once you get a 0.007, it starts to get a little too stiff. So, again, I'm in the same range. So now I have a thickness or a probable thickness of each plate. Then you have to calculate, okay, what's the void space between in their stack of gold plates? And what that means is, of course, if you have modern produced milled rolled plate that's cut and stacked, there's going to be very little void space because the surface is so smooth and you don't have any deflections in the middle, that kind of thing. So essentially, we know that that's not the way they produced ancient gold, so they would have to pound and use impact tools, and then followed up with polishing. Now, again, polishing, part of the issue of polishing, I would not expect them to be super highly polished, because if you polish too much, you'll remove the depletion, the gold that's there that you generated on the surface as part of your depletion gilding process. So I'm assuming they would polish them to a point, but they're not necessarily going to take off every reflection, or then they would end up with a surface where maybe they were close to exposing some of the underlying alloy. So, so what I needed to do was see if I could find somebody who had actually measured the deflection, meaning, because what would happen is, let's say you have deflection means that the metal surface comes out a little bit, maybe it pokes out a little bit at a certain spot. And so when you're stacking plates, if two of those deflections were on top of each other, then you would have a void space in the same, with the same thickness or same space as both of those deflections added together. If the deflections, were not hitting each other, then it would only be basically the max. The distance would be basically whatever the larger deflection is. Now, there's also larger, meaning you can have, like, the plates may not be perfectly flat. A plate may be a little bit warped, so you can also get some deflection there. However, in a large plate stack, on the bottom, that would be minimized. You might still have some, depending on, the strength of the plate, but you're mostly probably looking at the the imperfections on the surface. Which a lot of people, they just say, oh yeah, they'd all just flatten and there wouldn't be any void space. Some of the critics is like, they don't really understand, because you can't just eliminate deflection, some defection of the surface is not just going to go away by its stack, it's going to stay there. Unless you're putting it under a hydraulic press or something, it's flattening. So there were some measurements of some of these gold discs, similar, like the one I showed you a picture of. And they did actually measure, they classified them as highly polished, and looked at the surface variation, basically against the thickness. And as you can see, there were kind of different levels of polish, and some with outliers, like 131%, meaning there was a deflection there that was 130% of the thickness of the plate, meaning it was a big one. But for the most part, you can kind of see the ranges. And again, I'm not expecting the level of polish to be, so the 39, a little above 39 seemed to be, a reasonable. So void space of 50% seemed to be reasonable. I would not expect them to be as highly polished as those. So then what I had is basically I had the void space, I had a total number of plates, so I could get a surface area. Had thickness of 0.005, I'm assuming, and said, okay, I'm just going to run a scenario and see if, and you can go through all this if you want, but with different void spaces, plate separation, that kind of thing. So I used a lower plate separation. So I'm just looking at, because I've got to try to back calculate the alloy mix. So I need to, say, okay, there's 10 microns thick on both sides of the plates, also on the D rings, etc. So then I have gold, and then I kind of try to figure out what copper silver mix there may have been. In addition to that, to arrive at the 40 to 60 weight that was described. Yeah, this is the calculation. I'm not really going to go through it, but I just am showing it here if you want to go back, or the book has it in more detail. So in this first scenario, if I used all those parameters, I'd end up with 99.3 pounds. Well, that's not within the range of the weight. So then I need to look at some different parameters, right, underneath it. They're still within my measured or expected range. So scenario 2, we used a void space of 30. I did figure I could go up to 50 without too much, by the polishing, again, the highly polished you're creating on. I would not expect that high of polish on depletion gilding. So with that, I ended up 79 pounds with that void space. So I'm keeping all the other parameters kind of the same, just varying the void space. And what happens is you get more plates, obviously, with less void space. So scenario 3, I just used the void space of 50, which is the higher range of the merino plates, and arrived at 57 pounds, which that's within the range of the description of the weight of the plates. Ended up with 600 plates. Again, that's the way that's the only, a lot of these people just assume things. You can't, like this individual that wrote this book, he just assumed, oh, it's got to be this void space, and he said 20%, being generous. I mean, he didn't use any scientific information. You actually have to consider that, know what is potential, capable, possible on ancient metalwork. And anyway, so that scenario worked, the scenario 3. So I know we've got probably a void space in the range, 50%, maybe a little less, a little more, depending upon what you end up on your alloy. You can't fill with the alloy some, but it gives us a range. So then I tried, assumed thicker plates. So I had like the 0.05 range. And then I says, okay, now I kind of know roughly where I need to be in terms of the void space. Then I calculated using the thicker thickness of the range, and you can end up with 300 plates. And so essentially, you have kind of a range, like I said, 300 to 600 plates. Using that, you can back calculate with the weight as well, trying to figure out what the range, what you would expect in terms of the alloy mix, taking into consideration all the gold on the surface as being pure, and then your underlying base. So you have like a plate thickness, and had to assume, some silver content at a certain amount. And basically what I was trying to get is probably under these scenarios, kind of the highest gold content possible in the base metal alloy, which was 11.8%. It could be a little more, a little less. Again, this is not like an exact calculation. It's just a range, because you're dealing with parameters that you're starting out. And the gilding thickness would be kind of on the upper end, because the assumption is they weren't going to make some crummy gold plate. They knew they had to keep them over time. They had to store them over time. So they did have to have they wanted a higher gold content on the surface, obviously, to protect the plates. The corrosion, I kind of generally discussed it, but you actually, on a depletion gilding situation, what happens is you have the water in the gold. This diagram shows that the gold kind of protects it. You have the water itself has different parameters, which like pH and dissolved salts and things like that can actually affect the corrosivity. But the theory is the schematic is in the engravings, if you get water in there, then they can get into the substrate. I mean, this isn't really rocket science. And then corrode in the substrate, the copper or the silver, and then that kind of tends to cause separation, flaking, or bubbling of your gold surface. So the gold itself is not really corroding, but you can get corrosion of underlying alloy. Again, there is a parameter that once, if your alloy, even if your underlying alloy mix is above 50%, then you won't get very much corrosion. And unfortunately, that's what this individual basically said. He goes, oh, so you have to have, Tabaga has to have the underlying alloy over 50% gold. Otherwise, it would have just corroded. Again, not even considering the preservation box, not considering anything else, which that's not an incorrect parameter of the 50%, but he just assumed that anything below 50% would corrode, which is not the case, especially for high quality Tabaga. And the examples they have are direct burial. We'll get into that. The other thing I have to look at is, okay, I arrived at an alloy mix that meets the parameters, reasonable parameters of what I would expect of, so you have the proper thickness of the plates, you have the proper void space that you would expect in ancient metalwork. You have basically the dimensions, which you then calculate all of this through, but you do arrive at a certain ternary alloy, which is basically 3. So you have gold, silver, and copper. I'm not going to really explain this, but essentially the question is, okay, you can come up with a mix of alloy, but was it really workable? I mean, could you actually work with that metal? Because some metal alloy, if your content is too high or too low, it's not really workable. And it's basically, this yellow is just showing the range of those alloy mix that's not really workable. The little red is saying that's the range I arrived at, so it falls within the workable parameters of an alloy mix that could be worked anciently. So then I go to the questions that this individual raised in his book. For Robert, I don't know the individual back really to talk about him, so I don't know what his background is. I'm assuming it's not metallurgy. The description just seemed basic to assuming it's maybe social science or something. I don't know what he majored. So again, the question is raised of the 50% goal. Then he refers to an article that basically says, hey, Tabaga and corrode. He shows examples and of these Panamanian example artifacts of Tabaga that were basically cleaned up at it. But what he didn't talk about is those were very poor quality Tabaga, 1 to 2 microns. They weren't flat; they were basically cast little figures and things. So they have cracks and crevices where you can get metal cracking, and even your depletion gilding is difficult to do in a little crack to actually have it be very effective. And then it was direct burial, so they were buried right into the soil, so they had direct contact. And it was in a Panama's fairly, it had a lot of water. So yes, Tabaga that has below 50% gold in its base alloy can have corrosion. Again, the gold itself, they had to restore it. They restored it fine, but there was obvious, corrosion in the Tabaga, which that's not the way the plates were described. But as I said, I used a higher quality of depletion gilding, 10 microns thick. You got a preservation box, so I don't know if he was actually going through trying to find the only example he could, worst example he could of Tabaga corrosion, but he certainly didn't look at it. I mean, it seems clear he wasn't looking at all of the ranges So I'm looking at, okay, so I didn't really address this in the book, so I've got to go into some more detail and say, okay, let's see if I can find an example that would approximate the gold plate, meaning not gold plates, but at least an example of Tabaga that had at least a similar time period that it was buried, and also at least what a higher quality Tabaga. So the Moche, okay, I'm not quite sure of the pronunciation, the original pronunciation. That was a civilization that existed from 100 to 700 AD in South America. There was some pyramids in this location, Sipan, where a major archaeological, what was happening was the pyramids were being looted, and so there are these like great examples of gold artifacts and things. And so they went in and tried to stop the looting, tried to recover artifacts, and then they actually did some digging. So this was in 1988, and this is kind of showing the ruins of the pyramids, and then kind of the artist's rendering of what they probably. There's a small the pyramid that they excavated was a small one in the lower left. You kind of see little buildings and stuff. And there's kind of their excavation. Now, this pyramid had already been looted some, so they weren't sure what they would expect to find. They did discover a coffin. Well, wasn't existent. It was a wood coffin, so. But basically, the main tomb was around of this Lord of Sipan was 350 AD. So we have Moroni probably around 400 AD burying the plates. We have Joseph Smith recovering them early 1800s. This one would have been longer than that. So it's a 1650 or so. You'd expect even maybe more corrosion to have occurred with this one than what the plates would have expected. Now, the area is pretty arid, so different from the Panama. So there is at least that factor that you're not getting really high precipitation permeating through the pyramid. But you still have, they were buried and had direct contact with soil or soil equivalent. Can't mention buried 250 years longer. So it does at least, the preservation box probably worked better than the dry climate, but anyway, maybe you say that's equivalent. So this is the kind of they ran across it, it was basically a wood coffin. There was a layer that they could tell was wood. It had long ago to the soil, but they could see a different coloration. And then they sequentially excavated as they discovered, the skeletal remains and then the materials. So they would take off, excavate an area, remove that. So it was basically trying to do it in layers. So this is the picture of this individual. As you can see, there is corrosion there were copper objects in there as well as a Tabaga. So you can see it was subject to corrosion. You did have the copper corroding to a certain level. So it's clear that that there was corrosion going on. Corrosive activity in the burial. Now, I'm going to concentrate on a few items. The reason I'm concentrating on those items is not because necessarily they were the best preserved or anything, but they were actually analyzed as to the copper content. So that's the issue that was raised is, well, okay, you have these gold plates that are 12, maybe up to 20%, something in that range, depending on, I could change the things to get, a range. And so, okay, I have to make sure I've got an item that matches the alloy mix close to. So this particular one, and this is as they excavated. So you can see there's really no corrosion present. It was he had different things covering his eyes and his nose, and this is a teeth protector is kind of what they do. And you can see the top of the skull there. So that's, you're basically seeing as it was excavated. This is not restored. You know, this is as excavated, that is actually not corroded really at all. And again, these are the items that were excavated. So there was a study done 2022 of these particular items because they actually thought they were gold. They thought they were, yeah, again, gold alloy, high gold alloy, but they weren't even sure if they were Tabaga. So they actually analyzed all these, not all, but there was like a dozen, half dozen or so items from the excavation analyzed with Xray fluorescence, which actually, because that was the part of the problem is you couldn't really analyze them without doing destruct, you know, say, okay, let's cut off part of it and see what the copper, you know, content is, because you destroy the artifact. So they actually had to develop techniques that you could do it without destroying the artifact. And so they have an Xray fluorescence. And anyway, sorry, there's a misspelling in the presentation. Said so they're able to determine the underlying, as they went through, they could see the like pure gold on the surface, and then as they went down into the object, determine what the copper content was, and silver as they went at depth. So the tooth protector was one that actually, some of them had a little higher gold content. So, but again, I'm looking for the item, again, because the accusation is, oh, these would have corroded because they have less than 50% gold. Well, as you can see by this is what they determined on the tooth protector is at 9.5 microns of depth, you get, it's 80% copper. The surface was 58% gold. Again, that's one reason you don't have the corrosion. It wasn't necessarily even depleted to a pure gold. Maybe you could have had a depletion gilding, even higher concentration, which I think maybe plates did. And so anyway, so you do get, it's 80% copper. I had 12 plus the silver, some other percent, which also, you know, so essentially you're getting 12 to 20% gold is kind of the concentration. So this is comparable. And as you can see, there was no, even in a direct soil burial contact, the item did not corrode. So this Eccles, that's the individual that wrote the book. Just kind of, this is the name of the book. Again, he never referenced any of my work done in 2015. So again, I probably purposely ignored it. I mean, a recent book just came out by Richard Bushman, which talked about my work. I mean, it's out there. It's in university libraries. It's available for free on the internet. You know, again, it's peer reviewed, all that kind of thing. So actually, if you do a search, my work comes up like right at the first on a Google search. So he clearly, I can't imagine he didn't know about it. If he, and so he's only left with two options. If he didn't know about it, he's not a competent researcher. If he did, that's a dishonest research. So you're not left with the one there. And I don't know the individual is probably a nice individual. Clearly, it was again, I don't want to call academics hit pieces, but it was clearly, it was confirmation bias is at maximum. It's its maximum, trying to actually show that the plates could have existed. So again, his void space, he says, I'm very generous saying they're 20%. 10% is more likely. Again, he has no citations of anything. I don't know how he could arrive at that without any scientific investigation. And again, or very poor research. And as I've shown, even the most polished plates are 12 to 10%. those are not at all likely. Again, just because it's depletion gilding, what you would expect. You're not going to want to wipe out the engravings by rubbing and burnishing them continually. You don't need to if you do your depletion gilding properly and you have your patina properly generated in the engravings. You get, just like I showed in Peru, you get very good corrosion resistance, almost none. Then again, the thickness of the plates. He did no calculation. He just says, I think he did try to look at common tin or something, but he just said, well, various estimates, assumed, okay, 1/16 of an inch thick. Again, you don't get the rustling effect at that thickness or anything. So he says there are 96 plates. What he's doing is he's going on to try to show that there's no way you could fit the Book of Mormon on this limited number of plates, meaning you have to have a high gold content, which that's not even possible. So you would have had corrosion. Even so, even with the thickness of plates, you don't have enough room. Again, 96 versus 300. So no wonder he arrives at a bad result. But actually, if you use mine with what he's calculated, it fits just fine. So again, we talked about the 50% gold, which if you don't consider the void space, you get into bad calculation because you're using too thick, you're using too much metal in the plate stack. And actually, the higher number of plates, the higher your void space is, because you have thinner plates with more void space. So again, it's his errors. Most of the error is generated by his assumptions that are totally false, and not demonstrated by the facts of the plates. Again, he also doesn't look at the preservation box or looks at other higher quality Tabaga. This references a low quality Tabaga. So that were direct buried in Panama, high precipitation areas. So that kind of wraps up the kind of analysis of the Tabaga. Robert, you want to come in and maybe we can discuss that before we go on to the next?
No, I think that's pretty good because the issue of the gold plates, that's always been like a go-to source for critics. So you have Bill McKeever and Sandra Tanner with their plates, claiming like it would be too heavy for anyone to lift and for Joseph to carry, let alone run with. So hopefully we can actually put a death knell to this today, for at least people who are intellectually honest.
Right.
Sadly, Sandra and Bill are not, but more honest people out there.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the thing. I'm always willing to engage different points of view as long as they're academically based on some scientific parameters, not just these. That's part of the problem. Is again, I'm not an apologist really. I don't go out and just respond to everybody. I mean, you ask me to, I'm willing to, but it's kind of like if all you care about is confirmation bias of showing that the plates could exist, then you're starting off from exactly the point where you're never going to arrive at, where I arrive at. Because yes, I'm assuming the plates existed, but I'm taking the parameters of them and calculating and determining what we would expect. And I mean, the black engravings tell you that it's actually some sort of log. I mean, they wouldn't have protection on the engravings if they weren't trying to protect the underlying base metal. So what I'm saying is you can actually just take the description of the plates and tell them, and then use the parameters and arrive at number of plates. And I mean, I have also got some could the Book of Mormon, I didn't put it in my book and others have written on it, but I actually have kind of my own calculation of whether the Book of Mormon fit. And I use, because part of the question is, again, I did a translation of the characters document. What happened was I was working on this book, and then I was going to have a last section on character density. So, okay, it's Reformed Egyptian, what would we expect? How many words per square inch? That kind of thing, And so I started looking, okay, I don't have really a great example of hieratic engraved on, I'm trying to keep the same medium, some sort of plate, metal plate engravings. You have the plates of Darius, but those are basically syllabary language. There's 3 languages on there that have basically the same thing. So I was going to use that. But I thought, well, okay, I also need to kind of look at the spacing, what you might expect of, how close the characters were together. And so then I looked at the characters document, and that's where I ran into, because I had kind of fascinated with ancient number systems. I don't know, some people just had weird hobbies like me. And it's like I noticed, well, there's a Mesoamerican number, bar.9, right here. There's Egyptian 5 and 10 right next to it, and some kind of weird form of 4, which ended up being 400. So that's when I did the characters translation. I actually dropped the Ziff book and started working on that. I mean, I did publish the Ziff book, but I didn't really, because I figured I'm getting a translation. Why do I need to care about some projected character density? If I can translate this, then I can actually just calculate. I have the characters document, I know the dimensions, and so I actually have a number there, but I didn't include it in the Ziff book because I was still progressing with characters. So he again, that's the arguments you're trying to make is that the gold plates couldn't have existed, and then if they existed, they couldn't have fit. The Book of Mormon couldn't have fit. I didn't get into that, but it's clear it can, especially if you use his numbers and use my plate thickness, etc. You can arrive at a much a density of words in English that would fit on them, especially if it's 600.
Yeah, in that book, it's actually on your website. It's a translation of the characters document. It's actually now in a revised edition as well. So,
right.
Yeah, we also have one in the office, so that's good.
Yeah, and I think I do actually put in there what the density is. I can't remember. Just like one paragraph, I says, well, anybody that cares here would be. I don't know, that's a big book. I can't remember if I put it here.
Well, I know that you have like a brief presentation as well and some chronological issues as well. So while these, I'll go back in the background again, and I'll let you take as long as you want on that particular topic as well. So
okay. Good. Okay. I've written a large, lengthy book, which I'm currently just finishing up. Hopefully, I'll have the PDF out in October on my website, and then I do, have the publication of it, the hard copy. I don't make money off my books. I just print enough that libraries want to buy them, or I'll even donate them if they want. And then some people prefer hard copies, but I don't make any money on the hard copies. I just make all my research available for free. But I'm not going to go through the whole book. And Robert actually mentioned, he actually covered part of it in a prior podcast where I talked about the solar eclipse of iceberg, explaining the signs and wonders and that kind of thing. So that's part of the book because it's one of the things they establish is actually an exact date for the birth of Christ based on Book of Mormon, indicating there was a solar eclipse, and we know when those occurred, and there was one occurred in Mesoamerica, April 16th, and then you actually have a corresponding old world calculation. An individual astronomer basically went through what the Magi would have used in their astrological techniques to determine a divine birth date astronomically, and he arrived at the same date. I mean, he'd already arrived at that. I wasn't even aware of his work. But anyway, so that book is pretty expansive. I'm just kind of here responding. Robert asked me to respond to kind of the issue that this individual raised in his book, and that is basically the Lehi departure issue. Like 40 years ago, it was kind of, people started looking, I think you just started looking more carefully at the Book of Mormon. I don't know why this issue wasn't really brought up earlier, but there with the chronology, there appear to be three discrepancies. Discrepancies mean just not explained. They weren't seeming to fit very well together. You really didn't have an analysis of calendars or comparison in America or anything like that. But there were kind of three parameters that are discrepancies that seem to exist, and that's assuming you're doing, years, as assuming the years are all the same in the Book of Mormon as solar years. So if first is if Lehi departed the old world sometime from 600 BC to 587 BC. Again, I'm using that range just because that ends up being the way you can interpret certain Mormon. And we know Christ was born prior to 4 BC. 4 BC because we know Herod died at about the time of a lunar eclipse. That's what Josephus records. We know when the lunar eclipses were in Palestine, and 4 BC, so we know it had to be before 4 BC. So you end up with, you can't have 600 years passing, assuming you're measured in standard solar years. It's short. The second is kind of an internal issue, and that is Samuel the Lamanite's prophecy that 400 years would pass. He made the 5-year prophecy of Christ being born in 5 years. Then he also said 400 years a sort of justice would fall. The battle occurs 384 to 385 years after the final battle, Christ's birth. Thus, the passage of time is short, 389 to 390. Alma, the second Alma the Younger, prophesied a similar 400-year prophecy, but his was that after Christ ministered in the flesh, meaning when he came, that the Nephites would go extinct. Well, Moroni being the last one. At 420, approximately, says shortly thereafter he died. Again, it's short. So these are kind of the two. One is kind of an external. The other two are maybe internal, which I address and resolve in my book. So that's one reason I did the book is to handle any outstanding. I mean, it was number one to explain all of the different calendars, what's going on, but it also was to see if I could resolve these issues. Now, the first issue is the question of the proposed year of departure. And there's two things that you have to accommodate or try to accommodate in the Book of Mormon. One is the 600-year prophecy. The other is that in the third Nephi preface, it mentions that Lehi came out of Jerusalem in the first year of the reign of Zedekiah. Now, that's also mentioned in the first chapter of Nephi. So various people have grappled with this, and then they kind of, unfortunately, some of them basically said, well, Zedekiah named the Old Testament is not the Zedekiah I talked about by Nephi. They kind of have to modify history to try to get their things to work, what their proposals are. The one that doesn't do that doesn't have to do that, is Spackman, who was actually, a very, very thorough analysis, of which, surprisingly, again, this individual that wrote this book doesn't discuss any of this, any of the prior work that was done even 20, 30 years ago that resolves or almost resolves the issue he's talking about. He's not talking about the other two I mentioned, prophecies. He's just talking about this Lehi departure issue. So Spackman basically says, listen, you have an uncorrected lunar calendar that basically it's called, intercalated means you're correcting the calendar. I'm not going to use that term just because people don't understand it, lay people. So you're not correcting the calendar, you're just letting it run. So a lunar calendar is a shorter calendar. It's 353.47, I think, days per cycle, 12 lunar cycles. So it's a shorter year. So you end up, obviously, you can fit more years in what would be a solar. You're measuring solar years against lunar years. There's more lunar years than there would be solar. So Spackman uses that. And incidentally, I mean, Spackman doesn't really discuss this. I go into this in my book, is that actually the Book of Mormon tracks the way they counted months. They did, in the Old Testament, there was one instance where they used like names of months, Solomon's temple, but that was Canaanite months. They actually said the first, second, third, they just use numbers, just like the Book of Mormon uses for the months. So it's actually consistent that way. The Bible is clearly a lunar calendar now, and they don't show any 13th month. They don't show an additional month that they would add. That looks to have occurred after the exile. So you actually have a consistent, Spackman was correct, and he basically said, listen, they were running this lunar calendar. When Christ was born, they shipped it to a solar for whatever reason. He goes into, because that isn't actually, the lunar calendar isn't really used that much in Mesoamerica. I mean, they use moons and lunations, but they're mostly looking at a solar or their festival calendar, which they don't even care. Again, it's not trying to tie to anything. It just runs continuously, a 260-day calendar. And so essentially you have a lunar calendar that explains and provides for a late departure, meaning he departed just before the siege of Jerusalem started by the Babylonians. We have pretty good dates as the destruction. When Zedekiah was put on the throne, there's some Babylonian records, and then when the Jerusalem fell, we have good records. So essentially, Spackman resolved that. This individual didn't talk about any of that. Now, Spackman notes it still doesn't resolve. It's kind of this. Lehi came out of Jerusalem in the first year of Zedekiah. That's in the preface of Third Nephi. He acknowledges it may have been from talking about Lehi's when he first left for his prophetic calling, when he went to the lands of his inheritance, saw the fire coming out of the rock. But he says, textually, I can't see it. So that's another thing I did in my book, is I kind of show actually textually you can see the difference, the way they refer to departure. And then I also have picked up in my book that there's a Jubilee noted by Welch and Sink at the time of King Benjamin's speech, because it has certain themes that match the Jubilee themes. I kind of expanded on that and showed, and the characters document also had a Jubilee glyph at that juncture, and another one at the siege of the Gadiantans. And actually, if you look at that, it has the same themes. They freed captives, they freed slaves. They actually, the farmland lays in fallow for more than 1 year in the Jubilee. And actually, you see the Gadiantans came and they couldn't get any. There was no food, so it's pretty clear they came and there had already been a 2-year fallow period when they'd already, because they had accumulated reserves, they were able to kind of get together, form defensive area of the center of the land. So it actually matches that. So I'm not just using the characters document, actually the themes there. And if you count that Jubilee back 49 years, you end up basically the first time Lehi came out to get his prophetic calling. So that's the base date of the Jubilee calendar. So it actually explained, and that's where Third Nephi is talking about, the Jubilee actually. So anyway, that's in the book, but I wouldn't have expected this guy to have seen that analysis. But so we actually have a resolution to that. The other thing is, and then Spackman basically said they went to the Hob calendar, which I agree with. But the difference I found, the reason the prophecies weren't matching up on that calendar is because the prophecies were made on the earlier lunar calendar. So that calendar kept running. And so if you use that calendar, then it matches exactly the date of the last battle, matches exactly Moroni, the Nephites would have been extinct at Moroni's death. And, some people have a hard time understanding. They think that the calendar is just one thing, that you can't have, there's actually, in the Book of Mormon, there's multiple calendars running. And anciently they hadn't run multiple calendars. Most people don't realize is we have basically run 2 calendars and then have a third that we follow in a fossilized form. That is, we have a solar calendar that runs. That's our standard years. We have a weeks calendar. So we have a calendar of weeks. The weeks don't correlate at all to the solar calendar because we don't care. It doesn't matter that January 1st doesn't have to be a Sunday or something. It doesn't have to okay, that's the way we start our week's calendar. Have a half week at the end. No, the week's calendar just runs. So we actually do have, and they typically ran religious calendars continuously separate from the agricultural. People tied them together with these intercalations and corrections to try to get them to work, but under one calendar later. But essentially, like in Mesoamerica, they had these religious festivals. They just would go with that whatever time of the year it was. They weren't really harvest festivals. They did have those too. And you can measure solar. You don't actually have to have months to measure solar. You can just use the solstices or the equinoxes, which are easily measured. So you don't actually have to have all these months. You can just say, okay, here's the start of the year, here's the end of the agricultural year, and that's what the early calendars in Genesis, they actually weren't even necessarily tied to the solar. They were just harvest. So this is okay, within so many days of the barley harvest, we're going to celebrate this festival. So, and the harvest may have rained, depending on the weather or whatever, different dates. So they weren't even fixated on a particular, they weren't tying it to the solar calendar earlier on. And again, the early books in the Old Testament have been modified and the dates added specifically to a month, but most scholars agree that most of those dates were added post-exile. So essentially, the third Nephi is resolved. The other issue that you had that was kind of problem for some of the other ones, not Spackman and not myself, is that you have Nephi knowing that Jeremiah was imprisoned. Well, Jeremiah was imprisoned, and what happened is the Babylonians came, the siege started. There's some debate as whether it was a year and a half or 2.5 year siege, but they do know the destruction date. So, but essentially, you have what happened was they came, they put Jerusalem under siege, but then that was the reason. The reason that they did that is because allegiances had been shifted to the Egyptians. So an Egyptian army, at least a token one, came up, and so the Babylonians left the siege to battle the Egyptians for some period of time, some months, and then came back and put Jerusalem under siege. Now, during the break in the siege was when Jeremiah tried to get out, and they captured him and imprisoned him. So presumably Nephi had to have come back for the plates of Laban, and maybe even when they got Ishmael and his family, but during the break in the siege, otherwise they would not have been able to get into the city. And that's another reason why Laban and Lemuel probably thought, well, Jerusalem's not going to be destroyed. Babylon came and they left, right? They weren't successful in the siege. But anyway, so they had to know that Jeremiah was in prison, because that's when it happened, was during the break in the siege. So that also is accommodated by this late departure, right? So, people having Lehi departing way before the siege started had to try to deal with this problem. Some have said, oh, well, Jeremiah was in prison other times, we think, but there's no reason you have to do that once you understand what the calendar is and it actually measures. Again, this individual who wrote this. So my new research building on Spackman shows the following. Basically, that the Book of Mormon indicates, again, that the one thing you have to understand, in Mesoamerica, they just didn't pick some arbitrary day. If they're going to kill people on a day, it was a ritual day. And so in Mesoamerica, the Aztecs clearly did this, that they basically, because the belief is that the sun during an eclipse is being eaten by a snake, or the Maya think is a jaguar, they do certain things to stop that. One is before the eclipse and even during, they pound, make this big uproar in the land. There's actually a verse before the ritual day of sacrifice was going to occur that says that in the Book of Mormon. So that's why, and that was really only at a solar eclipse. So that's why I know there was a solar eclipse pending. That was the ritual day. They also kill, prisoners, and even light-complected people or albino people. And again, the theory is that the blood will strengthen the sun to fight off this jaguar. But anyway, so by using that date, the April 16th, and it's actually April 17th Hebrew, it's like the because there's a time difference, that this will accommodate all of the, using the uncorrected lunar calendar. It gives you exact dates that they left just before the siege came. And they left the land of Jerusalem, not just the city, because it says they left. The departure, the prophecy was based on the land. So accommodates that. It accommodates the Nephi returning during the break in the siege. If you're using this date, it also exactly matches the dates of Christ. We know that Christ, that's one of the other issues, is Christ. There's debate on, which year he died or was crucified, whether it was a Thursday, Friday Passover. Clearly, it had to be a Wednesday Passover if you're taking the Book of Mormon at its word of days of darkness, because when they came to the tomb early in the morning of Sunday, he was already gone. And you have days running from sunset to sunrise. Anyway, so again, it matches exactly, it matches the time length of that we know of Christ's life in the Book of Mormon, and the destruction date matches. So I also established there's a Jubilee calendar that matches the base date when Lehi got his prophetic calling. And that also runs through when they changed the solar year. They're still running the Jubilee. They're not celebrating it because they said the law of Moses, basically they're not observing it after, Christ came. But it's interesting because if you calculate that through, actually Mormon was born on a Jubilee year. And it's kind of interesting because we do have one glyph that Joseph Smith translated, or 4 glyphs. One of them is Mormon's name, and the glyph form actually matches the Jubilee glyph in Egyptian. So I think his name basically was given. It's a mirror image of it. And that's kind of interesting because of the year that he actually was born, because I now know the exact year, there and can compare it with astrological records. His name glyph also means vernal equinox in Mesoamerica. It's a period ending glyph. And that year, the vernal equinox, there was a lunar eclipse on the vernal equinox. So I do think he was probably born. That's a little bit of information. And I kind of think that's maybe why the rest of the wicked Nephites, they still followed him, because he had some sort of astronomical designation of being significant, rather than just his religion. So anyway, basically all of these issues are resolved chronologically. Now, this is much more than this individual wrote about. Anyway, it's been just a brief discussion. And this is kind of just I kind of showed the exact, when the eclipse occurred. And the interesting thing is the eclipse occurred at sunrise in Mesoamerica, at least a partial eclipse, which is kind of fascinating. And this, after the night of brightness, all of a sudden an eclipse comes. No wonder they freaked out. And then it set in eclipse in Persia, where the Magi were. So that's another, this individual that wrote about the Magi determining the date was not really aware of the solar eclipse. He hadn't looked at that, but that was probably why they actually did the calculation or started trying to figure it out. It's because they saw an eclipse. Because in Mesopotamia, that means the death of a king, potential rising of a new king. That's what eclipse means. It's a sign of the eclipse. In fact, they'd actually get like a fake king. Once an eclipse occurred, the regular king would get a fake king, in there, see if he died or something happened to him. If he didn't, then he would come back and kill him and then take back the throne. So it's kind of an interesting. So it actually, the solar eclipse actually matches very well, both the old world dates and present. I also have kind of the base dates of the Jubilee calendar, the reign of the kings, etc. We're discussed. Explaining the prophecies, how they all fit. And then this kind of the events in Jerusalem, which is more addressing kind of the issue this individual raised. That they all fit well. So that's kind of the kind of the synopsis of the chronology, hopefully answering the issue raised in this book that Lehigh basically is saying that Lehigh departure doesn't ledger.
Oh no, both those presentations have been very helpful, so I do appreciate you sharing the information. Any ETAs to when the Book of Mormon Chronology book will be finished?
Well, I'm doing the index, which I found out that's actually kind of takes a lot of time to get all the, you have to have it. But so I do release all of my material in PDF form on my website. So I will try to have that up in October. Then you have to set, the publication of the limited number of books that I do, probably like November, December.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah, because they proof them and you have to go through.
Yeah, in the show notes, I'll include a link to your website, but also your academia.edu website, so they can actually read your materials.
Yeah, I post them both places, right? But the academia also has other. That's where I put up the drafts, and there's certain portions of the book that are already up there, draft forms, but because that seems to be where. And it's not total peer review, but I do send out. In academia, you can just send it out to 1,000 people that are in that topic area, and then they can review it and respond back. So it does essentially is actually a very effective form of peer review, not necessarily gatekeeping peer review, but actually comment peer review. And of course, most people don't understand. I get that all the time. It's like, well, did you go to a peer review? It's like, well, articles are peer reviewed. Books maybe if an academic press, is publishing them. But I can tell you because no academic press picks up, unless it's like BYU or something, because they also are based on sales of the book, and so, and nobody will publish the other thing is I insist that I have a free electronic version available for download to anybody. No publisher will accept that criteria because they don't, that impacts sales. So sometimes I get some criticism. Well, why aren't you going through so and so? Desert Books contacted me, but I said, no, I got to have a free electronic version. He says, okay, well, we can't do that. So that's just my MO of the way I publish, because my motivation is not money. I don't care. It's mostly just my research. If people find it interesting, great. It's free to them. Most of the young people aren't going to pay for a journal subscription or to buy a book. And it seems to be that, those are the ones that tend to have a lot of questions. Not saying the older people don't have some, but they tend to have a lot of questions, so they can just go and read it.
Well, no, that's perfect. But as I said, I really do appreciate you making the time this weekend to actually give both these presentations. So really do appreciate it, Jerry.
Okay, great. When are you expecting to post?
Today. So.
Okay. Wow, you got it fast then.
Yeah. So with that, thanks for your time.
Okay.